Chapter 2. King and Queen. The heart of Paris was a little island in the Seine River, known as the Île aux Cités. To get to it, Eleanor and Louis had to pass through the noisy merchant suburb on the right bank of the river. They could see and hear the boatmen shouting as they unloaded barges full of fish, cattle, and salt, others groaning as they pushed barrels of wine and sacks of grain up the steep banks. Once they passed through the tower gate onto the fortified bridge, they had no view, for its thick, crenellated walls rose above their heads. A little beyond the bridge they entered the gateway to the royal castle, an ancient forbidding fortress built by early Franks long ago. Louis led his bride up the long flight of worn steps into the great hall of the thick-walled tower. The only heat came from logs burning in an open hearth, filling the damp air with smoke. Through the narrow slits that served as windows, the river traffic could be heard but barely seen. Eleanor shivered in the dim, cold passage leading to a small bedroom, which appeared to be carved out of solid rock. Off one corner of this room was a little tower room, the latrine, with a round stone seat above a hole and long shaft leading down to a pit far below. Outside the tower were the royal chapel, kitchens, stables, and a blacksmith's forge along the courtyard walls. The most appealing feature of this gloomy compound was the little garden, full of fruit trees and trestled vines that ran down to the tip of the island, where the river's currents joined and flowed on their winding course northward to the sea. Beyond the palace walls were noisy, crowded streets darkened by overhanging upper stories of ancient wooden houses. Swine and goats roamed the dirty roads, vendors shouted out the prices of their wine and pastries. Each street proclaimed its own activity: the street of the drapers, where cloth was sold, the bakers' and wine sellers' streets, and the street of the Jews, where Jews loaned and changed money, mostly for students. One got used to the constant rumble of mill wheels and the loud pealing of church bells. Eleanor found Paris dreary compared to her sunny south, the old castle primitive in contrast to the ones she knew in Aquitaine, with their tropical gardens, red-tiled courtyards, and fountains. She found the women prudish and dowdy. They had no sense of style, and the men deadly serious compared to her pleasure-seeking Aquitanians. She missed her native dialect with its rhythmic beat, its sing-song lilt. Eleanor was homesick, but she soon found out that at least Paris had its own excitement. It was the most popular center of learning in Western Europe, and swarmed with noisy students who came from all over to study there. Every student liked to boast that he had studied in Paris. From her garden wall, Eleanor could see the little bridge that led to the left bank of the river, where most of the students lived. Teachers lived on the bridge itself in tall wooden houses, clinging to the edge in higgledy-piggledy fashion. They held classes wherever they could, on stairways or in spaces between houses, where they lectured from benches. The bridge was a good place to draw a crowd, and the bigger the audience, the better the teachers liked it. The Queen, of course, could not become involved in student life on the bridge, but on certain days the royal garden was opened up to teachers and students. Sitting in the shade of a fruit tree, Eleanor listened intently to heated debates and lectures on morals, good and evil, and the laws of the church, all subjects new to her. She was even more intent on the rare occasions when some radical student dared to question traditions of the church. On a less lofty plane, she heard some amusing discussions in logic, such as whether a pig being led to market was led by the rope or the man, or what the color of a shield is if it is painted white on one side and black on the other. Eleanor carefully noted the clever methods used in debate and absorbed many ideas that would be useful to her later. As winter approached, the old castle seemed colder and drearier than ever. Eleanor was not one to accept things she did not like, and she soon set about making her new home more livable according to her standards. She brought in colored tapestries to hang on the bleak walls. She had some of the narrow slits widened into windows and ordered shutters for use in cold weather. She hired masons to build a new fireplace against the wall, with a chimney to collect the smoke. Knowing and loving music as she did, Eleanor found the choir of the royal chapel so badly trained that she dismissed the choirmaster and hired another. She also reorganized the management of servants, whom she found slovenly, and insisted that they wash their hands before serving meals. She ordered them to change the rushes strewn on the stone floors more often, What with the droppings of pet parrots and falcons and the hunting dogs, few of whom were housebroken, the castle often smelled like a zoo. It was not surprising that Eleanor soon ran into trouble with her mother-in-law, the Dowager Queen, who immediately took a dislike to her daughter-in-law. The old queen had lived happily for years in the ancestral castle, and now Eleanor, in a whirlwind of activity, was turning everything upside down. The queen mother could see no good in Eleanor, one of those frivolous southern belles, and disapproved of everything she did. She complained that her daughter-in-law was using up the royal treasury on lavish entertainment, unnecessary silk gowns, and fur-lined robes. She found Eleanor, who was not seen praying very often, a most unsuitable wife for her pious Louis. Worst of all was the huge retinue of southern friends, knights, troubadours, musicians, and elegant ladies whom Eleanor had brought with her. The old castle could scarcely contain them all, and the singing and dancing, the laughter and joking that began to echo through the once quiet halls were shocking to the old lady. Added to this was the growing scandal of Eleanor's sister, Petronilla, who made no secret of her love affair with an older married man. Much to Eleanor's relief, her mother-in-law finally decided she could no longer stand living in the same castle. She packed up her belongings and moved to a country estate. Eleanor had triumphed over her nagging mother-in-law, but she was disappointed that she could not transform her husband into her ideal of a gallant knight. Louis had gone back to his monastic studies and spent long hours praying on his knees in church. At least he made no objection to Eleanor's spendthrift ways, and though ill at ease with her southern friends, he sometimes joined their festivities. Even if he disapproved of Eleanor's behavior, he adored her. He wanted her to be happy, and he wanted her love. This may account for Louis's occasional rash and unpredictable actions. To prove to Eleanor that he was a strong king, he sometimes masked his timid nature and went to the other extreme. When the young couple got news of a revolt in Eleanor's favorite town of Poitiers, Louis reacted with surprising speed and ferocity. He would show his wife that he could handle her rebellious vassals. He and his knights sped to Poitiers, so fast that they caught the rebels off guard and quickly put down the rebellion, meting out unusually harsh punishments to all the townspeople. Then, as though he knew no other way to assert his kingly power, he brutally hacked off the hands of the rebel leaders. Soon after this, Louis got into double trouble with both the church and his powerful vassal, the Count of Champagne, over the appointment of an archbishop. Louis stubbornly insisted on his choice of archbishop, while the Count backed an archbishop already appointed by the church. The Pope had to intervene and wrote Louis a letter scolding him for acting like a foolish schoolboy and telling him to stop defying the church. This humiliated and infuriated the young king and made him more stubborn than ever, much to Eleanor's delight. Louis had given his oath to support his archbishop. Eleanor agreed that he should not break an oath, part of the knightly code of honor, no doubt as important to her as the laws of the church. But oath or not, the Pope could not tolerate Louis's defiance, and finally resorted to the most dreaded punishment, excommunication. Excommunication closed the doors to the church to Louis, denying him all church services. If he died still under the ban, his soul would be damned forever. Eleanor knew that her father and grandfather had been excommunicated several times and had simply ignored the punishment, but Louis was nothing like them. That the pious Louis should be excommunicated was almost more than he could bear and more than his subjects could understand. They thought it impossible that their most Christian king could suffer such a fate. Yet some demon now seemed to possess the young king. He and Eleanor blamed all their troubles on their difficult vassal, the Count of Champagne. Eleanor had her own grudge against the Count for his interference in her sister's love affair. Egged on by Eleanor, who so longed to have her husband prove himself a fearless knight, Louis gathered an army and invaded the Count's lands. His army attacked the poorly defended town of Vitry and set fire to its thatched huts and wooden houses. The townspeople, 1,300 of them, fled to the cathedral for safety. Then it too caught fire as flames spread to its timbered roof, which collapsed on the men, women, and children trapped inside. All were consumed in flames. This was too much for Louis. Horrified and stricken with guilt, he fell ill. The roar and crackling of the fire at Vitry, the cries of the people, haunted him constantly. He knew he deserved the wrath of God, and he feared for his very soul. He fasted and prayed continually. The Pope was impressed with Louis's sincere remorse and finally pardoned him. Still, Louis remained depressed and ill. Even Eleanor could not raise his spirits. Then Eleanor's spirits began to sink, but for a different reason. She had been married for some years now, and had as yet produced no child. She longed for a baby, and she knew that all France expected her to provide a male heir to the throne. Could she have offended God too? One person who might have prevented the young couple's rashness and steered them on a saner course was Louis's adviser, Abbot Schoyer, a tiny man of enormous energy and wisdom. But Schoyer had sensed that Eleanor and Louis had no desire for his or anyone's advice. He could see that Louis was so infatuated with her beauty, with his beautiful, if headstrong wife, that he could listen only to her. So Schoyer had tactfully left them alone and had immersed himself in a project of which he had dreamed for years, the rebuilding and beautification of the Abbey Church of Saint Denis, the burial place for all French kings. Schoyer was transforming it with the most modern, radical architecture and filling it with beautiful works of art. It was a bold experiment such as no one had ever seen before. Now that it was almost finished, he came to Paris and turned his attention to the unhappy king. Abbot Schoyer felt that Louis, still sick with remorse, had suffered enough. He now needed to be cheered up and to regain confidence so that he could rule his kingdom. Schoyer invited the king and queen to the dedication of his abbey church and arranged that Louis have an important part in the religious ceremony. Eleanor's spirits rose at once at the prospect of a diversion and a chance to put on her best finery. She and Schoyer had one thing in common: they both loved beautiful things. For the occasion, Eleanor wore a gown of pure silk with tight-fitting sleeves designed to show off her delicate wrists, as important as a slim ankle is today. Around her waist she wore a jeweled belt. Over her gown fell a long red velvet robe trimmed with fur, its full sleeves with their wide openings tapered to points that almost touched the ground. Over her hair was a scarf called a wimple, held in place by her gold crown. Married women were supposed to cover their hair, considered by the church to be a snare for the devil. But, like any woman's hat, a wimple could be attractive. Surely Eleanor arranged hers with an artistic flair. Her wrists were laden with bracelets and long pendants hung from her ears. She looked every inch a queen, but Louis, dressed in a drab gray cloak, looked like a penitent monk. No one would have thought this was the man who had recently ravaged the countryside with fire and sword. The royal procession moved slowly on its 7-mile journey from Paris to the walled abbot of Saint Denis. The road was jammed with white-robed bishops, hooded monks and pilgrims, knights and ladies, and a motley group of curious peasants and beggars, all eager to see Schuyer's new-fangled church. The king, carrying a silver casket containing the sacred relics of the saint, led the procession through the wide new portals heading for the high altar. A dazzling 20-foot-high cross, glittering with precious gems, and a gold figure of the crucified Christ, whose wounds were made of blood-red rubies, first caught the people's gaze. But even more awe-inspiring was the chancel, with its soaring vaults and delicate chapels radiating like petals of a flower. The whole sanctuary was ablaze with light and color. Beautiful tall windows with tiny bits of jewel-like glass sparkling in a rainbow of colors told stories of the Bible. Schoyer and his masons had been trying to find a way to let more light into the dim old church. By using intersecting arches and ribbed vaulting, the old-fashioned massive stone walls were no longer necessary to support the roof. In their place were what appeared to be walls of glass, and as Schoyer had planned, the light filtered through the stained glass windows appeared to come from heaven itself. Inspired by Schuyer's deep religious feeling, Saint Denis was the first true example of what was later called Gothic architecture. It launched the period of great cathedral building in ever higher and more daring experiments. Everyone was pleased with Schuyer's church and the uplifting service except one dignitary, Abbot Bernard, who disapproved and found all the gold and glitter distracting. He preferred simple, unadorned churches, where one's eyes should be closed in prayer and not be tempted to gaze at beautiful windows or precious works of art. Abbot Bernard, a mystic and a future saint, was famous for his miracle cures. Many considered him the holiest man in all of Christendom. Tall and lean, he led a blameless life and was as strict with himself as he was with others. His fiery sermons on sin reduced the wicked to fear and trembling. If anyone could make a man repent, it was Abbot Bernard. As for women, he thought most of them, especially beautiful, alluring women like Eleanor, evil corrupters of men. After the ceremony, Bernard had a talk with the Queen. Most people lowered their eyes when talking to this holy man, but not Eleanor. She looked directly at him and answered him with ease, showing that she knew as much about royal and church affairs as any man. Her boldness quite shocked the abbot. He also disapproved of Eleanor's elegant clothes, her perfume, and her eyeshadow. The clinking of her bracelets and the bobbing of her earrings disturbed him. Suddenly he realized that she must be the evil demon who had bewitched and led the king astray. He urged her to be a better, more obedient wife, and to stop meddling in the affairs of church and state. Eleanor had wanted to talk to the abbot, but she had not wanted a lecture. She wanted to beg a favor of him, that he use his holy influence and add his prayers to hers, that she become a mother. The abbot softened at this humble request. Perhaps his talk had done her some good. Within a year, Eleanor, now 22, had her first child. It was not the longed-for male heir that Louis and the kingdom wanted, but a daughter whom they named Marie in honor of the Virgin Mary. Absorbed in the joys of being a mother, Eleanor stopped meddling in affairs of state for a while.